Hi, this is Jade with trans-coding.com. On this episode today, we'll be going over GitHub and the GitHub repository, as well as some basics involved with the server and HTML. Once we're done with the GitHub commands, we'll go over the WAMP stack overview, as well as MAMP and LAMP stack, just to kind of cover, again, what we've done in the past and why we're building towards this idea of the stack in the future. After that, we'll go over an HTML overview and the basics for HTML. And finally, we will start the basics for a website landing page so that you can finally start representing yourself and your code. To get started with GitHub, we're going to head over to git-scm.com/download, and you'll see that there's an option here at the center of the screen for Mac, Linux, and Windows downloads. Since I'm on a Windows system, I'll go ahead and click Windows. Once that download has completed, go ahead, open it, and install the package. Because we're using Sublime Text, as part of the install, I'm going to set up Sublime Text as Git's default editor. If you use a different text editor, go ahead and set that as the default for Git's default editor. After you've set up the default editor, you may want to adjust your path environment. I'm going to go ahead and do it from the command line because that's what I'm used to. But if you want to do it from Git Bash or from Unix tools, if you're used to those, go ahead and select those options now. After that, you will need to choose your SSL or TLS libraries. I'm going to use the standard OpenSSL library because we will eventually be uploading this to a web server and we'll need SSL instead of the Windows Secure Library, so I'm going to set that as the default. For the next setting, because we will be working cross-platform and mostly committing to Unix in the future, or Linux, I'm going to leave the first item checked here so that it will do a conversion from Windows to a Linux setup. And again, because we're using cross-platform, we're going to use min-tty. For the next couple of sessions, the defaults will be fine. Once Git has finished installing, go ahead and allow it to launch the Git Bash, and we'll take a look at that. Alright, once GitHub has installed, it will open the Bash window for you. Once you're inside of that Bash window, there are a few commands that you will want to know. The first one is pwd, that stands for Print Working Directory, and that'll basically just tell you what folder you're in now. So on my machine, we're in the C drive /users/JT. In order to build a directory, we're going to want to go to the location for our website, and we're going to want to commit from that directory in particular. So we're going to head towards that general direction, and in order to do that, we're going to use the command cd. That stands for change directory. So we're going to use cd, and then we're going to type in the drive name and a colon. So that's cd p colon for me. And you can see now we're in the P drive, and you could always type pwd to verify that. And then we're going to navigate to the directory that we need. If you need to find those directories and you don't know your drive, you can use the command ls to list everything in the current folder that you're in. So you can see here we have the recycle bin, the desktop, system volume information, transcoding, downloads server, and temp download. So we're going to go to the server folder, and then we're going to head to data. And our website here is going to be housed in htdocs, but I'm going to stop at this point because this is where I want to store our keys, and I'll explain that in just a moment. I'm stopping one directory short of the folder that is holding our website, and this is the place where I'm going to initialize the repository. So the first step I'm going to do is let Git know who I am. So I'm going to use the command git config --global and then user.name, and then I'm going to put in my first name and last name. And I'm going to provide all of these commands for you so that you can just copy and paste them in. And then you can just replace first name, last name with your first and last name. If you receive no errors, you can assume that a command worked properly. The next command is going to be git config --global user.name, and then in quotes your name at whatever.com. And once we've set those up, we're going to initialize our Git. And you can see it is officially initialized an empty Git repository in this location, server/data/.git. Once we've done that, we need to create a file. Technically, we've already created a couple of files, so we don't need to create another one. But if you've not created a file yet, go ahead and follow the commands that follow. That's going to be touch test.txt, then git add git commit -m first commit. We're just going to do the commit portion of that. If you receive an error that there are untracked files like htdocs, which is one of the files that we do want to track in our commit, go ahead and use the command git add to store all files in it, and then do the git commit -m first commit again, and you'll see that htdocs has been added to it. The next step is we're going to share to our actual repository, which is online, which means that we're going to need to get some SSH keys. So the next step is going to be to actually build those SSH keys. In most cases, you're going to want to have an actual key folder. This is common in business practice. So I'm going to head to my P drive server, and I'm going to create a key folder. And in that key folder is where I'm going to store my SSH keys. In order to move back a folder, you can use cd --. The command for generating that SSH key is going to be ssh-keygen --t --rsa --C space and then your email address in quotes. You can see it provides a default address for your SSH key. You can go ahead and save it there and then move it to the key folder that you have provided. Once that key has been made, there will be a small picture on the screen as well as some fingerprint data. That means that the key has been generated properly. At that point, you can go ahead and navigate to the folder where that key was created and move it to the key folder that you created for yourself. Additionally, you can use the next command, notepad // .sh/id_rsa.pub, and that will pull up the key that was just generated in Notepad for you to use. Once you have pulled that up in Notepad, go ahead and hit Ctrl-A to highlight the entire key, and then Ctrl-C to copy, and you'll want to navigate to GitHub to place that key there as well. That will tell GitHub that this is your official key, and then you won't have to use the password each time in order to remotely connect to GitHub to store your files. So here on the GitHub page for trans-coding, we're going to head up to the top right icon. This is our icon. We're going to go into the settings page. Once in settings, we're going to choose SSH and GPG keys. Then we're going to choose new SSH key. And in the title, we're going to give it the same file name as before. This is going to be our ID RSA pub key. And then in the box below that, you will paste your key that was given to you on Notepad, and then you'll hit the Add SSH Key button. Once the key has been entered, you will see a little black key on the screen along with a few numbers next to it, and that'll show that the key has been verified. Next up, we're going to head back to our bash screen, and we're going to use the next command, ssh-T git at github.com. This is going to ask if we're sure we want to connect because the key fingerprint could not be established immediately, and we're going to go ahead and type the full word yes. That's going to add the RSA to our new list, and we have officially connected to that GitHub account. On mine you'll see it says, "Hi, transcoding, you've successfully authenticated." If you used a password to generate your SSH key, it will also ask you for a password at this point. Finally, we're going to connect up our local folder to the remote folder. In order to do that, I'm going to navigate back to the Git repository that we created. Since we're in the key folder right now, we're going to do cd ... to navigate backwards. And now we're in the server folder. And now we're going to head into the data folder. This is the repository that we built. And you know that it's the repository that we built because you can see in the bash that we now have parentheses at the end that say the word master. That tells us that we're currently on the master branch of the Git repository. If your Git repository does not actually have any branches on it yet, then you will have to create a master branch. In order to do that, the next commands are going to be what you'll use. So that would be git remote add origin, git@github.com, and then a colon, user slash, and then whatever your repo name .git is. For trans-coding, that would be this Git that I've set up for us here. That is github.com/trans-coding/getting started. So I would use the trans-coding/getting started as the repo. So the command we would use for that would be git space remote space add space origin space git@github.com :trans-coding/getting started. And of course, if there are no errors, it's not going to give you any messages. At this point, you could do your first official git push. What git push does is actually sends your files from your machine to the GitHub account. And once you've finished with that push from origin to master, you will officially have your repository up. At that point, any changes you make on your local machine, you will be able to change on your Git repository as well, simply by doing a git push or a git pull, depending on which direction you're moving from. So if someone else makes a change to your Git repository, you would do a git pull to pull those files from Git to your computer, and any changes that you make on your local machine, you would then push to the repository on GitHub. Alright, now we're going to take a quick review of the WAMP stack before we start digging into HTML. So first, I want you to recall that the stack is made of the letters WAMP, W-A-M-P. The first is Windows, and Windows for us is our operating system. So the operating system is really the backbone of your own personal computer, but for the purposes of our server, it is the backbone of the system that is running the server itself. So it handles the hardware, which is running the server itself. Now for us, the server is the A in the WAMP, which is Apache. For us, that's Apache 2.4, and that is your server software. And so Apache is what is actually running the protocol that allows your computer to deliver information back and forth. The M in the WAMP stack stands for MySQL, and that is your database. So databases are used to specifically store large amounts of information, and they tend to have algorithms built in which are able to be used to very quickly retrieve, gather, and store large amounts of information. Last is PHP, and PHP is generally known as a CGI language. So a CGI language, in generic terms, is going to be a standard protocol for web servers. However, in terms of what we're using it for, PHP is going to be used to interface the back end with the front end. So in other words, we're going to use it to build and interact with HTML, and we're also going to use it to interact with the database. And for the purposes of that, you could think of it by its acronym. Funnily enough, PHP is an acronym which is PHP Hypertext Protocol. So in terms of the stack itself, if we were thinking about this from the terms of a standard user, they would be using Chrome or their web server of choice, and from their web server they would send a request through the medium of the internet. The internet's going to be provided through whatever web service provider they have. That's going to be Comcast or AT&T or whatever internet service provider that user happens to pay for. Once that request gets to the system, it's going to go to the web server. In our case, that web server is going to be run by Apache, and Apache is going to decide what to do with that information. And so based on that request, PHP, going either through the back end or the front end, may go through the database, or it may end up just delivering some form of HTML to the user and deliver a graphics interface that can be interacted with. Once the server's figured out everything the user needs to see on the screen based on the request that was sent, a response is then sent back to the user across the internet in a response, and then they see that on their screen. So this is the basic structure for how the internet works. And so you can see this is why we have the server, we have our PHP set up, and we have our database set up. And that's all set up on the backbone of the server system's hardware, which is run by some sort of operating system, in this case, Windows. In the case of the personal server that we built earlier, we're not actually going over the internet. We're using Chrome to send a response to our own system. Our system is then sending a request to the Apache server. The Apache server then sends the information to PHP based on the request. PHP doesn't handle anything through MySQL right now, but we will build a database in the future, and that will also handle the front end and back end for the PHP request. The response is then delivered through the server straight through to the browser that we have, so no internet is required for that. This is why in our previous video we went ahead and we set up the HTTPD configuration for our server root, and that's also why we went ahead and set up the PHP INI so that we could set up the requirements for MySQL for our database in the future. And the htaccess file that we built specifies that only local requests are allowed so that no outside requests from the internet can be used on our own personal server. That covers the job of the operating system, the server, the database, and the CGI language that's used to deliver the response and request based on what a user needs. Alright, next up we're going to go over just a very basic overview of what HTML is, and then some of the finer details for HTML that you'll want to know as we move forward into PHP. So HTML actually stands for Hypertext Markup Language. You don't need to remember that, but what you do need to know is that HTML is not actually a programming language. HTML is a way of marking a document so that other sources can read it, understand it, and output text in a way that is understandable. So the way it does this is by linking things in what are called elements. One of the simplest elements is a paragraph element, and that's generally done by an open caret, p, closed caret, or a less than greater than sign. And then that paragraph is closed afterwards with the same symbol with a slash in front of the p. So this is technically considered an element. This is a paragraph element. And the opening and closing p for that paragraph is called an opening and closing tag. So HTML elements are enclosed with tags. One other important note about HTML is that elements can be enclosed within other elements. This is sometimes called nesting. So one of the other tricks that we can do with Sublime Text here is if we hold the Control key and click, we can get two different cursors up at the same time, and we can write the same text at both of those cursors. So I'm going to write strong here and close the second tag out. So you can see now we have a paragraph enclosure, and inside of that we have a strong enclosure. So this is the basics of HTML. It's just a way of marking up documents in such a way that any computer can understand them, and it makes them look the same so that everyone gets the same view, no matter what device you're looking at it from. So now that we have a basic idea of what HTML is, we're going to head back to our index.php. As we discussed before, PHP is technically a programming language, and it can call HTML within it. So we're going to use this index.php that we built earlier, and we're going to build HTML into it. So every HTML page then is going to have an opening and closing tag for HTML. Because we're using Sublime Text, we're going to use autocomplete for that. So in order to get the opening and closing tags, I'm just going to type HTML and hit tab, and it's going to generate them for me. Now from within HTML, we're going to start dividing up the page into its various components. The first components we're going to need are a header, which we're going to define with head, And you guessed it, if you've got a head, you'll also need a body. And if you're going to have a head and a body, if you want to, you can also add a footer. For the purposes of our page currently, the footer's not necessary, so we'll leave it out. Inside of the header, there are a couple of elements that we may want to add. The first is going to be a title. The title is going to be what appears in the top tab of the page. So for instance, in the previous video, the title was Installing Apache, PHP, and Sublime at Home, and you can see at the top that is the title that YouTube gave to the video. Our original index.php only had the PHP info, and so that was what it gave for the title. Instead, let's give this title something a little bit more useful. So the title might be My Homepage. And now when we refresh this, because we no longer have the PHP info, we shouldn't have anything on the page, but the title up in the tab should change. And you see now it says My Homepage at the top, and our page has gone blank. So we can start filling in the body. One of the most important elements for the body is going to be the H1 tag. The reason the H1 tag is so important is it's what's going to be used for SEO and SEM most times to define your page. Now SEM and SEO is search engine management and search engine optimization. So basically whatever appears inside of an H1 tag is what's going to be used by a search engine to determine when your page is output based on what someone puts in as a search term. So for something like this, we might just have an H1 tag of website tutorials. And as you might guess, we can also have H2, 3, 4, and on through 6. Just make sure that you never use more than one H1 tag on any single web page. And we can always hit refresh at any time to load these pages. You'll notice that the H1 tag is slightly larger than the H2 tag. Correspondingly, the H3 would be smaller than that, and so on. The other tag that we mentioned before was the paragraph tag, and this is where most of your text is going to go. So there's our paragraph. You can see it's also much smaller than the H2 tag, and the one we saw before that was strong. So let's go ahead and see what that does. One other thing to note here, you can see that it says matching bracket could not be found. So because we're in PHP, which is noted down here, this is PHP, which was auto-detected. This red square around the word strong tells us that one of these is not closed correctly. So it's a good way of checking the language, making sure that it's going to output correctly before we go and actually test it on the page. And so you can see that strong actually made the word paragraph bold. Outside of bold, one of the other common text changes you'll see in a document is italics. In HTML, that's going to be done with the EM tag, and that EM stands for emphasis. So you can see here that word paragraph is in italics. Outside of these, the most common tags you're going to see in HTML are the header row, and this is a self-closing tag. You can see that a header row actually causes a line to be drawn across the entire screen. So you can use this as a divider between different elements. Another tag that's commonly used is a break. This is BR. This is also a self-contained tag. What I mean by self-contained tag is it doesn't actually need an opening and a closer, so you can put the closing slash within the same tag. So that would be less than BR slash greater than, and that concludes the entire tag. Outside of this, when you're making HTML documents, you may want to leave yourself a note sometimes. So when you're doing that in Sublime Text, if you just hit Control and slash at the same time, that will leave you a comment block. You can see that here. That's an open tag with the exclamation, dash dash, and then a closing tag for that is the dash dash and the greater than symbol. And you can write anything you want inside of that, and that's not actually going to be shown on your page. So you can see that note isn't actually seen on the page. However, if we right-click and inspect, and we take a look at the HTML that's here inside of the body, you can see the note is visible within the HTML itself. We can also take a look at the paragraph, and we can see that there's a distinction between the phrase "this is a" and the bolding of paragraph. So you can actually look at various websites by right-clicking to inspect and looking at the various components of the website itself. Of note, when we click on this paragraph tag here, is you can see that there is an orange bar above and below on the left-hand side of the screen. This is the margin for a paragraph, and you can see in the bottom right hand corner here that for our paragraph element, it has the element itself is 569 by 18 pixels. It has no padding, no border, and it has a margin on the top and bottom of 16 pixels. This will become important for CSS later when we start styling, so I wanted to point it out now as a way of kind of getting an idea of the window, the proportions, and things that we'll want to take a look at for later. The other important part of the inspection window here is the console. The console is where we're going to look at output for JavaScript, and it's also going to give us error messages if there are any. This concludes the absolute basics of HTML and gives us a decent start to our website landing page. Next time we'll take a look at updating the header for our page to make it easier for a search engine to deal with our page and for users to have access to our page. On top of that, we'll start messing around with CSS a little bit. That stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's going to add style to our page and give us some color, give us some tools to work with the layout, the presentation, and maybe we'll even add a picture or two. I want to thank you for joining me again today. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to hit the like button, share, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next episode. This is Jade with trans-coding.com.